Everyone remembers Schindler as a great saint who saved over 1,000 Jewish lives. But no one tells you that behind it all, there are really just two words: great. The truth is far more complicated, more contradictory, and more unbelievable than you might imagine. This is the story of a gamble run by a womanizing drunk who only wanted to get rich off the war. A man who somehow fooled the entire Third Reich. And it all started with one absurd decision: to use free labor to make a fortune. On April 28, 1908, Oskar Schindler was born in Zwettau, a small German-speaking town in Moravia, in what's now the Czech Republic. The town was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, populated mostly by ethnic Germans, and the Schindler family was among his more respectable households. His father, Johann Schindler, ran a successful agricultural machinery business. His mother, Franziska Luther, was a devout Catholic. Together, they created a home where material comfort was plentiful, but moral guidance was largely absent. Here's a little-known fact that almost never gets mentioned. Schindler grew up living next door to a Jewish family. His closest childhood friend was the son of the rabbi next door. The two families visited each other on holidays. In the small towns of Moravia at that time, ethnic tensions were not nearly as sharp as they were in Germany proper. From an early age, Schindler had no fear or hatred of the word Jewish. That fact would later become the key to everything. If you had known young Schindler in the 1920s, you would never have called him a good person. He was an average student, smart but lazy, bored by books, obsessed with mechanics and racing. At 16, he did the first truly notable thing of his life. He forged his school report card, got caught, and was promptly expelled. The young Schindler was deeply in love with motorcycle culture. He owned a Moto Guzzi, a heavy-duty machine that was rare in Europe at the time, and competed in regional races. In the 1920s and 30s, riding a machine like that was a statement of both money and defiance. In 1928, he won the Youth Division Championship in the Moravian racing circuit. This chapter of his life is almost entirely skipped over in every biography written about him. After getting expelled, he didn't fall apart. He went to work in his father's machine shop and picked up practical skills. In 1928, he married Emily Pelzel, a traditional, hardworking, and beautiful woman who had high hopes for the marriage. But Schindler had never intended to be faithful. From the very beginning, he cycled through mistresses, treating marriage like a contract of convenience rather than a commitment. In the 1930s, the Great Depression hit Central Europe hard. Schindler's father's factory went bankrupt. Schindler himself sank into financial crisis, drowning in debt and going nowhere. By this point, he was every bit the down-and-out middle-aged man. No steady income, a marriage in name only, surviving on borrowed money and cheap wine. He needed a way out. In this desperate period, he made a surprising choice. He joined the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr, and became a paid informant. The Abwehr was building a network of sources across Central Europe in the 1930s, gathering military intelligence on Czechoslovakia. Schindler's native German, his smooth social skills, and his wide network of contacts made him an ideal candidate. He worked as an agent under the cover of a businessman. But the Czech authorities were no fools. In 1938, Schindler was arrested by Czechoslovak counterintelligence, charged with espionage and sentenced to death. Death. That word nearly wrote the final line of Oskar Schindler's story. Then fate stepped in. In October 1938, Nazi Germany annexed the Sudetenland under the Munich Agreement. The Czech court's verdict became worthless overnight. In a single moment, Schindler went from a condemned man to a citizen of the Reich. Not only did he survive, his background as an intelligence operative gave him the first connections he would need to the Nazi upper ranks. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. Schindler's eyes lit up. He didn't see the terror of war. He saw opportunity. Factories were being seized and abandoned in the chaos. Cheap, even free, labor was everywhere. The war's appetite for surplus was endless. A clever businessman could make an absolute killing. By October 1939, less than 2 months after Poland fell, Schindler had already arrived in Kraków with everything he owned, which amounted mostly to charm and nerve, with very little actual cash. Under Nazi occupation, Kraków had been made the administrative capital of the general government territory, the political and commercial heart of the entire occupied region. There he made contact with Nazi officials through old Abwehr connections and launched his social offensive. His strategy was simple: drink, give gifts, tell jokes, make everyone like him. The room Schindler first rented in Kraków had been taken at a forced low price from a Jewish family, completely normal practice in the occupied territories at the time. Schindler later admitted freely that during this period, he felt nothing about what was happening to the Jews. That was someone else's problem, not his. By late 1939, Schindler had used his connection to acquire control of a formerly Jewish-owned enamelware factory on the outskirts of Kraków. The factory had been called Record Limited and manufactured kitchen enamel cookware. Under Schindler, it was renamed Deutsche Emelwarenfabrik, DEF, what the world would later know simply as Schindler's factory. Here is a crucial figure that most versions of this story left out. Abraham Benker, a Jewish former shareholder of the factory, was the man Schindler first turned to for advice when he took over. Benker gave him a business tip that at the time seemed purely clever: hire Jewish workers. The reason was simple. Under Nazi racial laws, Jews were barred from most professions and had to obtain work through German employers. Their wages were paid not to them, but directly to the SS. This meant that for an employer like Schindler, Jewish labor was essentially free. He acted immediately. By 1940, the factory was running with a large Jewish workforce, churning out military enamelware and kitchen goods. Orders poured in. Schindler was making money hand over fist. His initial reason for wanting to protect his workers was entirely businesslike. He didn't want his trained, skilled employees arbitrarily taken away and replaced. The production line needed stable people. Frequent turnover hurt output and quality. There was no moral glory in this reasoning whatsoever. But that is the honest history. Schindler's social instincts were first-rate, but his lifestyle was wildly conspicuous. He haunted upscale restaurants, wore custom-tailored suits, kept suites in the finest hotels, and lived Krakow's nightlife to the fullest. In a time of war, this level of excess inevitably attracted attention. The Gestapo began watching him. During the war, Schindler was formally arrested by the Gestapo at least 3 times. Not once or twice, as the film might suggest. The first arrest came in 1941 for black market trading, a serious economic crime under the Nazi system. The second was more absurd. At a public gathering, he kissed a Jewish girl on the cheek as a friendly gesture. In any normal world, this would be nothing. Under Nazi racial law, it was racial defilement. Rassenschande. Schindler was taken away on the spot and thrown in a Kraków jail. The third arrest, later in the war, was tied directly to his lease operation. Each time, he talked his way out. Using the network of drinking companions he had carefully cultivated among the Nazi elite, and enough bribery to make it stick. But each crisis made it clearer to him. This entire system ran on money and connections. And that, of all things, was the game he knew best. In 1942, large-scale roundups of Krakow's Jewish population began. Survivors were forcibly relocated into the newly established Kraków Ghetto. This put Schindler's factory in a position to recruit workers from nearby. But it also put scenes of increasing brutality directly in his line of sight. In March 1943, the Kraków Ghetto was liquidated. Large numbers of Jews were shot dead in the streets. The rest were sent to the newly built Płaszów forced labor camp nearby. The commandant of Płaszów was an SS officer named Amon Goeth. Goeth was not merely someone who enjoyed killing. According to extensive survivor testimony and post-war trial records, he would stand on the balcony of his hilltop villa each morning and snipe at prisoners in the camp below, purely for entertainment. His Czech wolfhounds had been trained to attack and maul inmates. At his post-war trial, the catalogue of crimes was almost beyond counting. Schindler and Goeth developed a strange kind of partnership. Schindler supplied the liquor, cigarettes, black market goods, and female company. Goeth provided protection and flexibility. The two of them drank through many nights in Goeth's villa. But Schindler knew, in the back of his mind, that this man could put a bullet in anyone at any moment, sober or drunk, including him. On March 13, 1943, the Płaszów camp formally opened. The Kraków Ghetto was liquidated on the same day. On that day, Schindler rode out on horseback and watched from a hillside overlooking the city. What he saw: the entire Jewish population of the Kraków Ghetto being dragged from their homes at gunpoint by armed SS troops, lined up, sorted. The elderly, the sick, the weak, shot on the spot, falling in the snow outside their own front doors. Blood ran in the streets. Cries and gunshots and shouted orders blurred together into a single sound. Before this day, Schindler had been able to keep what was happening to the Jews at arm's length, to treat it as an abstract policy problem, background noise that didn't concern him. This wasn't just a personal choice. It was the most precise engineering of the Nazi system. Keep the killing inside numbers and paperwork. Never let it become a face, a cry, a real pool of blood. As long as the distance holds, a person can keep pretending they are not involved. But Schindler had a crack in him that others didn't. He had grown up in Moravia, next door to Jewish families. His childhood friend was a rabbi's son. The two households visited each other on holidays. For Schindler, Jewish people had never been an abstract symbol on a propaganda poster. They were people with names, faces, and laughter. That crack, left over from childhood, had always kept the wall of distance from being fully sealed. Then the factory had given him years. Day after day, he had looked at the same faces on the production line. The accountant who kept his books was named Stern. The old worker with the bad leg still showed up on time every morning. The women who smiled when they were given an extra piece of bread. You cannot look at a face you have known for 3 years and tell yourself it isn't human. That is the one thing every killing machine fears most. Not rebellion, but recognition. And on that day, from the hillside, the slaughter stopped being a distant rumor and became something happening right in front of him. The last wall came down. After that day, Schindler could never rebuild it. After that day, the option of looking away was gone. Different historical sources record this scene differently. Some historians believe the story of Schindler witnessing the liquidation was exaggerated or reconstructed as part of building the Schindler myth. However, testimony from multiple factory survivors confirms that after early 1943, Schindler's behavior toward his workers changed in ways that were visible and consistent. Whatever the actual trigger was, the change itself was real. The shift was slow, and it was full of contradiction. Schindler began doing things that made no business sense. He started spending his own money to buy extra food for his workers, quietly funneling it through the factory's supply channels. He began falsifying records, listing elderly workers as skilled tradesmen, registering children as essential personnel, making it harder to single people out for removal. His factory began to take on a strange quality. It felt like a shelter. But something must be said clearly here. He didn't become a good man. He simply was never fully broken by the system that turned others into minsters. He was too self-centered, too willful, too resistant to authority, to ever smoothly adopt the bureaucratic distancing logic of mass murder. His bad character, his recklessness, his bone deep, I don't care about the rules. Ironically, it was these very flaws that kept one crack in his humanity from being sealed shut. His flaws protected his humanity. Of everyone who ever witnessed Schindler up close, perhaps the most qualified to speak was Itzhak Stern, the Jewish accountant at the factory, and the true operational mind behind the rescue effort. It was Stern who first saw the crack in Schindler and began, step by step, quietly filling the ledgers with people who had absolutely no legitimate claim to be there. In a sense, it was Stern who guided Schindler, not the other way around. In his post-war testimony, Stern repeatedly said that Schindler never suddenly awakened. The change was a long, grinding process, full of fear, hesitation, and constant self-doubt. Stern said he sometimes felt that Schindler himself didn't fully understand what he was doing, but he couldn't stop. That is what real human nature looks like. Not a good person doing good things, but a person who was never fully made into a bad one, making one small, almost instinctive decision at a time. In fear, every single day. By the summer and fall of 1944, the Eastern Front had collapsed. The Soviet Red Army was pushing west at an overwhelming pace. The German occupation of Poland was in a free fall. The Nazi High Command issued an order. Close Pashov. Send all Jewish prisoners to the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp. Kill them there. For anyone at that point in the war, Auschwitz meant one thing: death. Schindler faced a choice. Purely in terms of business logic, the answer was obvious. Pick up, take the enormous fortune he had made during the war, and disappear to Switzerland, or somewhere even farther away. South America perhaps. The money was staggering. Years of military contracts and black market profits had stuffed his personal safe with gold, diamonds, dollars, and high-end jewelry, more than enough to live out the rest of his life as a wealthy man anywhere in the world. He didn't run. Instead, he made a crazy decision. He would move his factory to a small town in the Sudetenland mountains of Czech territory, a place called Brunlitz, and take every single Jewish worker from Płaszów with him. He went to Goethe, and with his most polished lies and most expensive bribes, dressed it up as a sound business plan. His factory was essential to the war effort. He needed this specific group of machine-trained workers. He would relocate production to the Czech region and continue serving the rice. Goethe agreed, and then the list was made. Schindler's List. In the film, those words carry a sacred weight. Black and white, the sound of a typewriter, each name pulled back from the hands of death. But the real history is far dirtier. In the historical record, the list was nothing more than a long tedious factory personnel transfer application, existing in multiple versions, drafted by multiple people, revised again and again. Its creation was chaotic from the very start, and Schindler himself wasn't present. At the time, he was being held in a Nazi detention facility on charges of black market dealing, though the truth behind that charge was more complicated. The Gestapo had evidence of illegal foreign currency, falsified factory expense reports, and a long-running black market network. In other words, he was saving lives at the same time he was stealing. Both things were happening in the same man at the same time. That is the real Schindler. The document that decided the fate of 1,200 people was completed without his knowledge, by other people's hands. Two people were primarily responsible. The first was Itzhak Stern, the factory's Jewish accountant, and one of the true architects of the rescue operation. In many ways, it was Stern who had guided Schindler to this point, not the reverse. The second was Marcel Goldberg, a Jewish auxiliary working within the cracks of the Nazi system, who held effective control over who made it onto the list. According to testimony from multiple survivors, Goldberg openly accepted bribes in exchange for names. If you could pay in gold or jewelry, your name went on. If you couldn't, you stayed behind to die. What does that mean? It means that every step of the process that produced this document, later called a sacred list, was soaked in corruption, fear, and the darkest corners of human nature. It was not the solo redemption of a single hero. It was something cobbled together, desperately, by a group of people trying to survive, using every means available to them, including the ones that would never make it into any movie. There were roughly 1,200 names on the final list. Behind every name was a story, and behind every name that didn't make it was a story too. During the list's execution, a catastrophic mistake nearly destroyed everything. The female workers who were supposed to be transported to the new factory in Brunlitz, around 300 women, were sent to the wrong destination during transit due to a combination of railway chaos and bureaucratic error. Their train pulled into the entrance of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The entrance of Auschwitz. That meant selection, gas chambers, crematoriums. When Schindler found out, he mobilized every connection and resource he had left. He carried jewels and valuables and went in person to the administrative offices of Auschwitz, using bribery to secure a transfer order for those women. This was not a movie effect. This actually happened. He walked into the administrative building at Auschwitz and pulled those women back from the edge of the gas chamber. The women arrived at Brunlitz weeks later, reunited with the others. You can call him a liar. You can call him an opportunist. You can say he was never any kind of saint. All of that is true. But those 300 women had already entered Auschwitz. On paper, they no longer existed. No one would have asked questions. No one would ever have known. He could have let it go completely. Instead, he took his jewelry and walked into that building. Walking in to negotiate was itself a moment of extreme exposure. Any official who paused for even 1 second. A German businessman coming to plead for Jews. And he was finished. And so was everyone on the rest of the list. He wagered his own life against the lives of those 300 people. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because there was anything to gain. Not because there was any reason that made it worth it. He just went. At this point, the question of whether he was a good person or a bad person no longer matters. The only thing that matters is he went. And that is enough. The Brunlitz factory was officially set up as an armaments plant, producing mortar shell casings. Schindler managed to convince the Nazi authorities to designate it as a critical imperial facility, which shielded its workers from deportation to the death camps. But it was the most expensive fraud in history. Schindler quietly ordered his workers to sabotage the output. He instructed them to adjust their machining tolerances so that every shell casing they produced would fail Nazi armament quality inspections. The Brunlitz factory ran from October 1944 until the war ended in May 1945. Nearly 7 months. In all that time, not a single shell casing it produced passed the official quality verification test. Not one. To cover up this production failure, Schindler spent enormous sums buying already certified, finished shell casings from legitimate military suppliers, mixing them into his factory's shipments, and fooling the armament inspectors. He was not only saving lives, he was funding a small act of sabotage against the Nazi war machine out of his own pocket. Between bribes, food purchases, black market goods, and the direct buying of people, Schindler had burned through nearly all the fortune he had made during the war. By the time it ended, he was nearly bankrupt. During those months at Brunlitz, Schindler maintained an unusual kind of human order inside the factory walls. He allowed the Jewish workers to light Shabbat candles every Friday at sundown and hold their Sabbath ceremony. Throughout the entire Nazi-occupied territory, this was a strictly prohibited religious act. But inside the walls of the Brunlitz factory, those candles were lit every single week. When the factory received a group of male prisoners transferred from an Auschwitz subcamp, men whose bodies had been broken by years of hard labor, Schindler insisted on giving them extra food and basic medical care, even setting up a small wall on the factory grounds. Under Nazi logic, this was completely uneconomical. For any inspecting official, it could have been grounds for a charge of aiding the enemy. On May 8, 1945, the European war officially ended. On the night the German broadcast announced unconditional surrender, Schindler gathered all the factory guards, told them the war was over, gave each one a bottle of vodka, and let them walk away quietly. No violence. Then he assembled all the workers in the center of the factory for a brief memorial to mourn the 6 million Jewish lives lost in the war. When the war ended, Schindler had to flee immediately. As a former member of the Nazi Party, which he had joined in 1939, primarily for business purposes. He was a target for both the Allied forces and the new Polish government. With help from his workers, a group of senior factory employees wrote him a letter of testimony in Yiddish, detailing what he had done during the war, to serve as his safe passage as he fled west. The escape route was organized by some of his Jewish workers. They arranged his clothing, his money, and his path out. A man who 1 month earlier had been nominally their employer was now a fugitive who needed their protection to survive. History doesn't often produce ironies this sharp. What followed was a life of drift and failure. He tried the cement business in West Germany, then fur trading, then prefab concrete paints, each one ending in collapse. He moved briefly to Argentina, tried farming for a few years, and failed just as thoroughly there. He and Emily had been separated for years. She stayed in Argentina. He lived with his mistress in difficult circumstances. His health declined steadily. In his final years, he survived largely on regular financial support from Schindler's Jews, the survivors and their descendants in Israel, who wired him money to keep him going. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, Schindler traveled to Israel almost every year to visit survivors and their families. In Israel, his status was far more honored than it ever was in Germany. For a long time after the war, German society found Schindler deeply uncomfortable. A former Nazi Party member, a profiteering opportunist, making a hero out of him was morally complicated. On October 9, 1974, Oskar Schindler died in Hildesheim, Germany. He was 66 years old and had almost nothing. By his own wish, he was buried in the Catholic cemetery on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, Israel. He's one of the very few former Nazi Party members ever laid to rest on Israeli soil. If this story moves you, that's good. But if all you take away is a great saint who saved 1,000 people, then you've only read a trimmed down, two-tidy myth. The real Schindler was a liar, a drunk, an unfaithful husband, an opportunist, a former spy, and a businessman who put a price tag on human lives and negotiated with the devil. He never became a good person on any particular day. He was pushed by history, by circumstance, by the faces he saw every day, slowly, reluctantly, and painfully in that direction. Throughout that process, he never stopped being afraid, never stopped calculating, never stopped doubting himself. That is precisely what makes him real. That is precisely why his story cannot be filed neatly under good or evil. History does not manufacture saints. It only does this. In its darkest moments, it forces the most imperfect people to make the most impossible choices. When the empire fell, when the world went completely mad, a greedy man who was not wicked enough ended up looking like a hero. And those 1,200 people, their descendants are scattered across the world today, numbering more than 8,000. That is the true legacy of Oskar Schindler.